Good morning. Ambassador Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, Shri Daman Dhungana, Shri Dinesh Tripathi, Mr. Chok Sharing, distinguished panelists, chairs, and friends. It's a great honor to welcome to the Institute Ambassador Shiv Shankar Mukherjee. When I contacted him, he was gracious enough to immediately say yes. So on behalf of the Institute and HBF, I am very grateful and thank you, Ambassador Mukherjee, for giving us the honor to host you. Ambassador Mukherjee is from the 1971 IFS batch. He not only topped the exams that year, he was the youngest ever to join the civil service. And you know, he has served with distinction as our ambassador to Nepal and Egypt, and as High Commissioner to South Africa, Namibia, United Kingdom, and I think a couple of other countries. Let me also welcome two of our guests from Nepal. Shri Daman Dhungana is the former Speaker of Parliament and now a prominent civil society leader. Shri Dinesh Tripathi, a senior advocate of the Supreme Court of Nepal and a friend of the Institute and particularly mine. I also welcome all the participants. India and Nepal relations are unique. I would say, like all couples, we go through phases of intense resentment. So there are good years, not to mention a lifetime of memories built together. But there are also month-long fights filled with bitter accusations. But then, suddenly both the parties collapse on the floor, exhausted. When I say that, I am not certainly prescribing yoga for couples nirvana. Cultural affinities and familial ties no doubt provide comfort for familiarity, perhaps also an instinct for fraternity. But closeness and familiarity also beget contempt, jealousy, and paranoia. India and Nepal relations today have come to a stage where many of the experts in both the countries have started talking of resetting these ties. Nepal's policy towards its big neighbors is also changing, so are the policies of the two big neighbors towards Nepal. Should India begin to recalibrate these ties? Or should India continue to see Nepal as a bridge between India and China? India definitely has a legitimate interest in political and economic stability of Nepal. So these are issues that we have the kind of panel to discuss in course of the day. If India uses the so-called roti beti card, China perhaps is using the checkbook diplomacy. Some experts warn that Nepal has become de facto battleground in a geopolitical struggle for regional supremacy between India and China. Indian experts also caution Nepal that one has to be careful with the so-called dragon's embrace. Nepal, to my mind, has been undergoing 5 simultaneous transitions: political, national, industrial, urban, and social. In other countries, these revolutions were staggered, but in Nepal, these are happening simultaneously. While it has completed the transition from a monarchy to a republic and from civil war to a democratic order, federalism that Nepal has built for itself by adopting a federal constitution is like an edifice without the walls. Nepal is still creating federal institutions, but building federalism doesn't come easy. I would say it is like a marriage, you have to do it every morning. federalism has to be worked upon, it has to be nurtured. Today, Nepal has a federal constitution, but it is wrestling with what someone calls cartographic anxieties and geography of anger. While drafting a federal constitution, Nepal went through massive mood swings from you can do no wrong to you can do no right. Finally, the realization dawned on them that federalism is, after all, a good thing to do. I'm very happy that we have an excellent panel of experts to deliberate on three major issues: on new trends in India-Nepal relations, then China as a factor, and finally the federal experiment and what are the challenges that Nepal has. So I will stop here. I will thank you very much.
First, and I say this because this sometimes leads to a certain amount of misinterpretation of what I'm going to say, which is that when I talk about an entity called Nepal and its policies and its actions flowing from those policies, I talk of the Nepali establishment. I talk of the Nepali polity and its associated entities, and I do not refer to the people of Nepal. And that distinction, I think, is very important, at least it is to me. Secondly, in a reasonably happy retirement, the views I express here, however subjective, however provocative, are my own, and please don't, because of my past association of 40 years as an Indian diplomat, please do not interpret them to be in any way reflective of what today is the Indian government's position, or they may be not. I must thank you for your very kind introduction of me as a distinguished diplomat, but the fact is that at the moment I'm a very extinguished diplomat. First of all, I think, given the tyranny of time and the fact that it's absolutely impossible to cover the entire gamut of history and the very, very fast-moving developments that have taken place in Nepal internally and our relationship with Nepal, this will have to be a kind of a patchwork discourse in which I, based totally on my own experience and judgment, have just selected a few things to talk about, which I consider important. And inevitably, the very knowledgeable audience, and I see knowledgeable people here, including extremely important people who are involved in the developments like Damandung Banerjee, will find gaps, but perhaps, you know, as we proceed with the seminar, those gaps will be filled. The two things I want to first deal with, one which resonates very much in Nepal and one which resonates very much in India and therefore impacts both countries. Let me deal with these two things first and then go on to the rest. The first is what started the modern political relationship between India and Nepal, which is the 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Prithvinarayan Shah described Nepal as a yam between two boulders, a phrase which is frequently quoted to underscore Nepal's geopolitical situation, which is that of a small nation sandwiched between two Asian giants, China to the north, with the mighty Himalayan range limiting contact with the northern boulder, and India to the south, where the hills of Nepal fall away into the plains of the Terai, and where these plains merge seamlessly into the plains of India, not just in the physical sense, but because of the fact that the border has been historically an open border, and the 1950 treaty actually only formalized it, makes this seamlessness even more significant. This context is important. The context is that the treaty came into the wake of events that led to the end of the 104-year rule of the Ranas in Nepal and the restoration of the monarchy, with a promise of progressing towards a democratic Nepal through the election of a constituent assembly. I don't want to focus too much on the many, many years that passed by before that promise was even halfway realized, but that's how it started. Over the years, to cut a long story short, most of the treaty's 10 articles have been eroded or simply gone into limbo, such as the article on informing each other of any friction or misunderstanding with any neighboring state and to consult on procedures for import of arms, ammunition, and warlike material. But the most important articles, which are 6 and 7, the most critical from Nepal's point of view, remain in force in actual practice and not just on paper. These are the articles enjoining each country to give national treatment in their country to citizens of the other country, which you referred to just now, but significantly for Nepal's, for the importance it is for Nepal's obligations, a letter of exchange actually exempts Nepal from reciprocating. So the national treatment accorded is to Nepali nationals in India and not vice versa, because the government of India at that time agreed that given Nepal's size, its fragile economy, and its state of development, and the fears of it being sort of swamped by its much larger neighbor, this was necessary. And so it continues till today. This has kept, in many ways, Nepal's economy afloat. And in fact, and I don't exaggerate, kept it from becoming a failed state economically, more than any other economic factor. Because of this agreement, as many as 7 to 8 million Nepali people live and work in India, exactly as Indian citizens do, most of them coming from the poorer sections of the population. And in fact, seasonal migration sometimes swells this number to almost 10 million. The social and economic cost to Nepal, if burdened with these numbers in addition to those already unemployed or underemployed in that country, is mind-boggling. Add to this the fact that these Nepalis resident and working in India represent the bulk of the Nepali diaspora working abroad, and a diaspora that accounts for, through its remittances, fully a quarter of the budget of Nepal, will give you an idea of the huge impact, positive impact of this treaty and these articles on the Nepali economy. I mean, if I quote Kanak Dixit in his book on peace and the peace process in Nepal, he says, if you think of Nepal-India relations as a people-to-people more than a state-to-state affair, then it is the matter of labor migration that is the central overarching concern. More than 2 centuries, the Indus-Ganga plains have provided recourse for Nepal's poor, serving as a place of refuge and economic survival, while the rulers in Kathmandu reveled in national insularity. Even today, I think the remittances from India are by far the largest part of the remittances that flow into Nepal and are such an important part of Nepal's budget, its total budget. I saw some figures recently that the remittances from Malaysia are in fact, through statistics available from banking circles, the highest in recent years. And that, I think, is utterly not correct, simply because from Malaysia, certainly, everything has to go through banking circles, whereas by far the bulk of remittances from India are in cash, just sent through normal informal channels, non-banking channels, or even carried across when the millions go back to Nepal for visits, especially during Dashain. So the fact is that the treaty has been of abundant use to Nepal, but when I said it resonates in Nepal, just about every political party or leader has in the past very frequently referred to this as an unequal treaty, demanded its, at the least, modification or its termination. In fact, when the Maoists presented their list of 40 demands to the Nepal government in 1996, the very first demand was an abrogation of this treaty. The position that India has taken, I think, has been the right one, which is that at the request of Nepal, it is entirely for Nepal, under the provisions of the treaty, to request for either a continuation, a modification, or a termination of the treaty, and that India would be willing to enter into discussions with any of these options as an aim. Subsequently, at the level of the Foreign Secretaries, a committee was supposed to be formed to discuss this, which is, I think, almost never met. The calls for this continue to be made. To my mind, they are made simply to score political points, and which I will come to in the second subject that I mentioned. Fuel this whole equation of ultra-nationalism with anti-Indianism and gain some instant political popularity on that basis. Because Nepal has never followed up whenever we've responded to the demands for any modification or termination or even continuation. So the only criticism I found in my 4 years of discussions on every subject under the sun in Nepal, including this one, frankly, the only concrete criticism I found coming out of Nepali leadership across the political spectrum, and even sometimes in civil society, was that it was signed by unequal people. It was signed by the Prime Minister of Nepal on the one side and the Ambassador of India on the other. Now, the fact is that its legality remains pristine, regardless of the inequality of the protocol position of the two signatories, frankly, because the Indian ambassador has the plenipotentiary powers to sign that agreement, and this can hardly be made as the touchstone on which that treaty has been successful, positive, and helpful or not. As I said, the Indian argument, with which I agree, is that it has been of enormous help to Nepal's economy and development. This whole question, the second question I want to deal with and finish off, and a little more of this later in terms of the changing contours that we are talking about, is this thing that resonates very much in India, that, oh, we do so much, and yet the goodwill that needs to be generated out of all our efforts is not there. Why is there so much anti-Indianism in Nepal? Now, again, this is obviously a very complex matter, needing all sorts of addressing of nuances, but let's, but in a political sense, let me put it this way. It is paradoxical, considering the fact that the ties that bind us, which were referred to in the introductory remarks, are total. They're cultural, they're religious, they're political, they're economic, they're social, at every level, in terms of familial links, marriage links, you name it. The foundation should be for utter and total understanding between the two countries, and yet it's not. Right from the 50s, I think, when things changed, and the restoration of the monarchy and an interim government that was supposed to lead to a constituent assembly and so on, and the insertion of Indian advisors, Indian advice, or whatever, was seen by the elite in Nepal as interference. But more than that, starting from King Mahendra's time, I think, who was an expert at this game, this really was the ultimate weapon to cover up the failures of the monarchy, and later the policy continued under Rana rule, by finding a convenient scapegoat in India. This brainwashing continued, and the rule usually followed the thinking of the rulers. The message was that it is India that is trying details, but overall, if you keep it simple, that India is trying to assimilate Nepal, absorb Nepal. That is the big brother trying to rip off Nepal and prevent it from charting its own course, and therefore the only obstacle they face, which is guarding Nepal, is the monarchy, and later on, of course, the Rana rule, and therefore total subservience to the monarchy is necessary to make sure that this does not happen. This was the basis, I think, for equating this whole business of anti-Indianism with nationalistic fervor. It afforded a very simple and easy way, particularly in a feudal structure, to find a ready-made, convenient scapegoat for its own failures in just about every area of human endeavor. These created stereotypes and perceptions which, you know, they are long-lasting. They don't go away easily. And they are present even when there are, you know, the dynamics of relations change, even when times change, even when much more openness comes into the relationship. But the whole concept, which on the one hand, in earlier days allowed the monarchy to attract support by blaming its failures on Big Brother, was very avidly taken up by the politicians themselves for the same purpose, to garner votes, to get instant popularity. In fact, to the extent, right up to almost the present day, the worst thing you can tell an Nepali politician that he is an Indian agent. That's about the kiss of death. So that is this allied to the fact that barring Delhi, I think, Nepal is probably the world's champion in conspiracy theories, Kathmandu particularly, and the fabled sort of rumor mill multiplies these stereotypes very, very quickly. This, on the Indian side, I think, there's a danger of exaggeration. There's a danger, I think, and a lot of thinking Nepalis, especially in civil society, know this and address this, that this kind of feeling tends towards being exaggerated and perhaps create a kind of backlash in India itself in terms of its policies, which, to my mind, at least in my experience, India has done well to guard against. There has been no backlash whatsoever against the Nepali people that are resident in India. And in fact, there are voices I know within the government that guards against this. More on this, I think, when we talk about the new contours, because this is one of the things that has to be dealt with, ignored, or tackled in some fashion. We now come to, I think, the reasons for discussing a topic like the new contours of India-Nepal relations. And I think the very simple reason for that is the fact that it is a new Nepal we're dealing with. On the 1st of February 2005, then King Gyanendra made his most fundamental mistake by grabbing power. That led to a train of events which led to, after the November 12-point understanding and so on, the seminally important People's Andolan, which led to the new Nepal that we all know and that I'm talking about. Nepal came close to democracy in 1990, but not quite. but the People's Andolan, which was in every way a completely genuine people's movement across the political spectrum and social spectrum, really gave rise to the new Nepal that Nepal internally is dealing with as an exercise in nation building, and a new Nepal that we have to now contend with and deal with and engage with for the good of both. That Andolan was in fact the precursor, the door opener for the real, truly democratic vision, or the attainment of the democratic vision of Nepal, an inclusive democracy, an opportunity for those who had been dispossessed in the past, oppressed in the past, and I'm talking about people like the Madheshis, the Janjatis, the Dalits, who had been left out of development and being a dignified part of the state in every way. And that led to then, I think, the problems that arose in, when I was in Africa, we used to talk about Africa's second and third liberations. The first liberation was, of course, decolonization, with the liberators liberating themselves from colonization. The second liberation was because so many of them then, frittered away the newly won independence into dictatorships, and the second liberation was referred to as the liberation from the liberators. Nepal, it was different. I mean, there was no question of replacing the monarchy with some kind of autocratic rule, but there was a different problem, which was the aspirations of those that had been hitherto dispossessed and who then wanted a place in the sun in the new Nepal. And the problem, one has to be very careful in making, in passing very brief judgment on very complex issues. But the problem remained that the ruling elite, basically Kathmandu-based, the Baun Chetri elite, the Baun Chetri Pahari elite, wanted a new Nepal, but did not want a new Madhesh. Wanted a new Nepal, but wanted the old Madhesh, and the old Janjatis, and the old Dalits. That was rejected by those who were at the receiving end, and you had the Madheshi Andolan, the Madheshi agitation of 2007. It led to an agreement on February 28, 2008, where I was present, where the Prime Minister of Nepal then, Girja Babu, and the Madheshi leaders, Mahant Thakur, Rupendra Yadav, and Rajendra Mahato, signed, and agreeing to Madheshi demands for, basically an equal and dignified place in the Nepali sun, autonomy, representation in government institutions, all that was denied to them in the past. In the past, in fact, if you were a Madheshi, you had to have permission to even visit Kathmandu, almost like a visa, quite apart from all the other oppressive impositions of the state on a people that were consigned to second or third class citizens. These were included in the interim constitution that Nepal managed to forge by consensus. However, and I'm dwelling on this now as leading up to the current day, when the constitution making process, as you all know, was delayed, full of potholes, and eventually the constitution was promulgated on 20th September 2015, almost uniquely in the world by majority vote, not by consensus. This was the document that would define the democratic, inclusive nature of Nepal, but it didn't do so. That led to two things, among others. One was an uprising in the Madhesh, And secondly, new problems, major problems between India and Nepal, the ruling circles of Nepal. Now here one must mention that this question of anti-Indianism that I was mentioned, the Madheshi issue becomes central. I'm appalled at the Indian press as well that keeps referring to the Madheshis as people of Indian origin. If they are to be referred to as people of Indian origin, then we have to refer to Bangladesh as people of Indian origin, and Pakistan as people of Indian origin, and probably Iceland as people of Indian origin or whatever. These are people who've been staying where they are now for millennia. They are the natives of these places. They are Nepali. And since the beginning of modern Nepal, they have been treated as an adjunct of the neighboring parts of India. You know, this is, you know, these are the legacies of colonization, and my African experiences sort of underline that. This drawing of borders, which sometimes does not really reflect the reality on the ground, but in today's world of nation states are to be followed. Now, the Madhesis were therefore not only seen as inferior people, as second-class citizens, but as an adjunct of the people of the adjoining states in India, as more or less Indian agents, as a fifth column inside Nepali society, as India's sort of fifth column to disrupt Nepal should it wish to, and so on. And so when the Madheshi agitation came about, for the third time actually, 2007 was actually the second time, both these things happened. There was violence in the Terai, people died, and if you remember, in the 2007 agitation, the dead included only the Madheshis and others in the Terai, not the security personnel. In the agitation post the flawed attempts at the constitution promulgation, again, the ruling elite coalesced against what was already had been promised to the Madhesh and written understandings, including in the interim constitution. And of course, India was accused of meddling and supporting the Madheshi cause openly or clandestinely or both. This is the vicious circle that adds to what I was talking about in terms of the perception. And it is more a perception than a reality, but the perception of Indian meddling and Madhesh being deliberately or otherwise, by acquiescence or by enthusiasm, part of this deep Indian overall plot. Well, anyway, this led to what you all remember was the blockade of the border and extreme difficulties caused to people in Kathmandu and elsewhere with the shortage of cooking supplies, with the shortage of medicines and so on and so forth. Accusations of India having created the blockade, either actually creating it, fomenting it, or at least, even if the Madheshis did it, by, you know, looking, you know, sort of living with it and looking away from it and letting it go on. There was television coverage in Nepal itself that showed that the blockade was instituted by the Madheshi agitation, and regardless of whether India acquiesced in it, and as all, you know, and not did enough to clear the blockade, that was seized upon in Nepal by those elements that remain wedded to garnering political brownie points by pointing fingers at India as the main meddler and obstacle to Nepal's development. This led to a kind of a huge resurgence of all that kind of anti-Indian rhetoric and statements from the government. and this was at that time the government of KPS Oli, who continues that tirade even today. So that became the real problem, which was a pity because, you know, you mentioned this ups and downs in relations. This was very much a down. This came in the wake of, I think, a very successful visit to Nepal, but the first visit in 17 years by the Indian Prime Minister Modi. The visit was a huge success, not just in terms of all the help that was provided, indicated and promised, $2 billion worth of aid in credits and grants and so on. But quite apart from that, in his speech to Parliament, which resonated throughout Nepal at that time, and you know was positively referred to countrywide, including in the media, was his complete underlining of Nepal's sovereignty. You know, making it abundantly clear that India was there not only to help, but to help exactly how Nepal wants it to be helped, about India determined not to be seen as micromanaging or trying to intervene in Nepal, but also talking about inclusive democracy, which was a gentle hint towards the fact that agitations in the Madhes and the spillover effect into India is a matter of concern for India. It is a matter that concerns Indian security. And the message was clear, even though not you know, put forward in so many words. But as I said, this whole episode of the Madheshi agitation, which got linked, as before, to India and its policies, you know, represented a huge downturn in relations. You know, when KPS Oli visited India during that time, as he said, to remove misunderstandings in his statement out, you know, to the press, but there was not even any joint statement issued. The differences were, you know, seen to be pretty acute at that time. That situation has, to some extent, I think the dust has settled. There have been visits since then by prime ministers of Nepal, different prime ministers of Nepal. And when I say different prime ministers of Nepal, I now come to the, I think, beginning of the discourse on changing contours. Do we really, you know, there are two ways of looking at it. One is to look at the day-by-day internal dynamics of Nepal. And that, I think, would be a sound academic exercise and relevant in terms of day-to-day diplomatic activities. But in terms of our overall vision on both sides, I think we have to take a broader and a more, to use a very cliched word, a more holistic look. The political parties in Nepal have not been able not just to create a constitution that was passed by consensus and acceptable to all, not even been successful in passing amendments that brought this closer to that goal. They have gone ahead with local elections, which to the ruling elite shows that most of Nepal has accepted their policies and the way ahead as defined by them. But to outsiders seems as though problems are being brushed under the carpet and therefore are shoring up trouble for the future. That, I think, is true. Today, the youth in Madhesh, after all these agitations, and Nepal, if anything, is a very open country now. In fact, the reach and the tarai of the FM stations is far more intensive than it is in India. People know what's going on. And people in the tarai, particularly the youth, are politicized as never before. And that, although I don't live in Nepal anymore, that is apparent from, you know, the interaction one has in Delhi as well as, you know, one's look at Nepal. In fact, the kind of secessionist moves that are being tom-tommed through Madhesh, through people like Dr. Raut and so on are finding more and more resonance in the Madheshi area. Nobody knows better than Mr. Daman Dungana, whom I'm waiting to hear, who was the facilitator along with Padmaratna Tuladar, who tried to bring the Maoists to the table of negotiations first of all. And I wish I had the papers here, but his warnings at the time the Constitution was being made about the need for inclusivity, about the need for consensus building, about the need for looking at the Constitution as a guide to the future of Nepal and not as a political tool for self-serving politicians to entrench their positions, for political parties to look beyond their political party agendas. Those were made by him and people like him time and time again before the Constitution was finalized. But regrettably, that very, very important advice was not followed. So what do we have today? The internal dynamics of Nepal, I think, with the best will in the world, one can say, is a little uncertain. The elections are going through. The third phase of the local elections in I think, province number 2 is around the corner on September 18th. The Madheshi issue has not been solved. There are Madheshi leaders who voted for the Constitution because they belong to different parties, and they explain it away by saying that they had to, those who voted because of the party whip, which is not something that is bought by many in the Madhesh, the argument, but that is what happened. There are weaknesses in the Madheshi leadership. The lack of unity in the Madheshi leadership is apparent to people in the Madhesh itself as well as outsiders. Regardless of all that, the fact is that the Madheshi issue is probably the most important. Madheshi, Janjati, Dalit, the dispossessed issues are not going away, and until these are addressed transparently, they will keep the internal political dynamics of Nepal on tenterhooks. They will attract most of the political capital and the political energy of the political spectrum in Nepal to the exclusion and to the detriment of the much more important developmental process. So what is the new contours? Now, as you've noticed, much of what I've said is more or less being a partisan with respect to India's policies and more or less critical of the political parties that are shaping Nepal's future. But the fact is that we are compelled and should engage with the political parties. We have to give ourselves the same advice that I remember as representative of the Indian government I gave to the King of Nepal. At the time when the king justified his grabbing power by saying the politicians are squabbling, they're ruining Nepal, they don't get together, they don't concentrate on development, they're self-serving and so on and so forth. Our message to him was that this is not an excuse to reject democracy. The political parties may have their flaws, but they are the political parties. They are the representatives of the people now and in the future. And regardless of these flaws, we must deal with them because the ultimate goal is a democracy that reflects the people's aspirations and reflects what people want. And therefore, if sauce for the king, if that was sauce for the king, it must be sauce for the gander, which is India. I don't think it is to India's advantage to either sulk or to get into that overreaction mode of let's teach them a lesson or anything of that kind. The peace and the stability and the prosperity of Nepal remains key to India's security interests. That is a given. That goes without fear of contradiction. Therefore, our engagement with the government, rapidly changing governments, if you please, in Nepal remains essential. Whether it is a government that is comfortable with Nepal, as it was during my time, I'll expatiate on that later, or whether it's a KPS-Oli government that is, accusing India of all sorts of nasty policies all the time. It doesn't matter. The engagement has to be there, because we should realize also, and I think we do, and that must be underlined, that this is a very young, very new Nepal. It is a Nepal that is, won its full-fledged liberation from a feudal order as little as a decade ago, which is just a moment in time in the growth of a nation. It is a poor country that has not many resources to fall back on its own. It is engaged in the task, a mammoth task of nation building, after a couple of 100 years, 239 years of state neglect, of a feudal order that neglected the state completely, that did nothing for the betterment of the lives of its people, except personal self-aggrandizement. It's a mammoth task, made much more difficult by that earthquake that struck Nepal. But even without it, it is something that we in India, and I go back to the India locked, some Nepalis are wont to say about Nepal being India locked. India, they should look upon it as India opened. It's up to us as the country with which Nepal's future in development is totally tied up. And regardless of the Himalayas opening up and passes opening up and the railway lines that are being constructed from Tibet to Nepal and the roads that are opening up, regardless of all that, for the foreseeable future, it is India that must stand foursquare with Nepal. It is India that must put in its place, if not ignore, refuse to be affected in terms of overall policy by such things as perceived anti-Indianism, rhetoric that is hurtful to India, and so on and so forth. It must hew fast to, I think, a very, very partnership vision which was, I think, the crux of Prime Minister Modi's speech in Nepal, which resonated so positively throughout Nepali society at that time. We have to understand this. We have to partner Nepal in its basic task of not just getting the constitution, completing the peace process, which is still frayed, but in the overall task of reaching the goal of a peaceful and a stable and a prosperous Nepal. So what are we supposed to do? One, just a quick laundry list. Politically, we must continue to make it very clear to Nepal. We are not interested in either micromanaging or macromanaging anything to do in the internal affairs of Nepal, that our perception of their sovereignty is complete and without any blemish. However, like any other nation, if we have a problem if we perceive problems, if we perceive situations that are inimical to our national interest or to our security or to anything that impinges on our national interest, as is necessary between two adjoining nations which have had a very, very strong relationship in every area, it would be up to us to mention this to the government in Nepal, for us to receive a patient and hearing, and then cooperation in terms of going ahead. As far as the treaty is concerned, I've already mentioned, we should tell Nepal that if you have a problem with this treaty or even other agreements, India is completely open to discussions. Our mind should be as open as the border is. And frankly, over the last few years, this has been made abundantly clear on our side at the political level, and we should make sure it filters down to the bureaucratic level and action on the ground. On development cooperation, I think there should be absolute and total implementation by India enthusiastic implementation of projects that have already been identified and new projects that are emerging and will emerge in the future, including those that were signed up recently during PM's India-Nepal visit. The fact is that the goodwill that should come to India, and which people in India and the, and the opinion-making levels here say, why can't we get the goodwill that we are doing, on the base, because of what we are doing in terms of development cooperation. The fact is that although much of the development cooperation is happening and being completed in good time, the fact is that some of our major projects are being implemented slowly, with bureaucratic and other hurdles, with delays, and that, in fact, prevents us from getting the kind of image, the goodwill that we deserve on those projects. I mean, you look at the postal roads business, which is key to development in the Terai, the feeder roads that go off the main highways, agreements on which have been agreed upon for years and years and years ago, and action on the ground has been glacially slow. The whole concept of development cooperation becomes the reverse. Instead of doing good and garnering goodwill bilaterally, it becomes a subject of complaint at every meeting. And that is something that has to change from our side. Border infrastructure, it's a mess. We've talked about it non-stop. I think both sides are to blame for this. If you go to the Birganj border, which is the most important area for, the checkpost for transport of goods and people, you'll be appalled at the state of the border infrastructure there. And if you extrapolate this to all sorts of other things, including phytosanitary conditions, nearby laboratories for checking vegetable exports, and so on and so forth, there's a whole litany of things which have been agreed upon, on which there are agreements, on which both sides know what to do, but precious little is being done. Now, with hopefully more active Nepali governments on this and much more active action on our part, this will need to be remedied. This includes various obstacles, irritating obstacles that exist on the economic and commercial area. A lot of our perceptions are those, a lot of our problems are those of perception and stereotyping. And we are not alone in this. We must never seek to, or be seen to be micro or even micromanaging in Nepal. We are, if not the big brother, the elder brother, the more senior partner. And it's up to us to go the extra mile. If our common aim is to better, is for a better and more secure life for both our peoples, then it is up to the political leadership on both sides to sensitize their peoples that working together we can achieve our goals. And not working together hurts both countries. In fact, our attitude on India's side should be nothing to do with altruism. It is enlightened self-interest. Because what is good for Nepal, what makes Nepal stable and prosperous and peaceful, is very good for us. If we complain about things like agitation spilling over into India, then it's up to us to join in the efforts to prevent such a thing happening without seeming to be meddling in Nepal's affairs. So the new contours of India-Nepal relations are not yet well defined, and I would call it work in progress. We must keep in mind, as I've mentioned more than once before, that our policies must deal with the fact that Nepal is facing very huge and daunting problems in its nation building as it addresses its huge economic and social and political issues, and it needs all the help that it can get. We must therefore rally for this purpose unstintingly. We must not get distracted by such things as anti-Indian rhetoric. After all, the bottom line is this rhetoric does not hurt India physically. It is not an attack on India. It is something that irritates. It may be something that bothers us, but there is no threat in this to our national security or anything unless things change. And finally, leading from this, let me just mention one thing that is always the elephant in the room, which is China. The China card was a very hardy tool used by King Mahendra and his successors. It was seen as one way of balancing out India and China and extracting more from India at opportune moments. The China card over the years failed. Indeed, in earlier governments, whenever, Surya Bahadur Thapa told me himself, when he went as Mahendra's emissary to China to seek certain things from China, which would be, a reminder to India that Nepal is not in the Indian camp, and as a sort of to pinch India a bit, it was China that told Nepal that, look, here's the map of the region, here is Nepal, here is India, and this is how they explained it to him. You have to therefore keep your relations with India on an even keel and have good relations with India. That was the advice even given to Prachand when he visited China, his first visit, although it was linked to the Olympics. But recently, things of course have changed, as we all know. Even as recently as the time I was in Nepal, I left in 2008 after the first Constituent Assembly elections. The Chinese dealt with whoever was in power. They dealt with the king, they supported the king when the king was in power. When the king was ousted and the political parties were in the forefront, they very nimbly went to the political parties and said, we'll work with you. And a Nepali delegation that came to Nepal called on me and made it very clear what they wanted. They did not want to, really play a political role in Nepal. They wanted basically Nepal to support, to agree to the one China policy that China wants of the whole world, which Nepal did, of course, and that Nepal should be very careful about the Tibetan refugees, because that was China's problem within Nepal, that they wanted them to be contained and not to be used again for any anti-China activity. The last couple of years, or even longer, has seen a complete change in that. To put it very briefly, China's economic presence, of course, was always there and getting very, it was, which is the way in the rest of the world, about its unstoppable rise in its exports and its economic presence. But more than that, China has made it very clear that it is now already is and wants to be even bigger as a political player in Nepal. It was very openly, when the rift took place between Prachand and KPS Oli, and Prachand then formed a new coalition with the Nepali Congress, and the musical chairs business of Nepali governance continued, openly tried to build a leftist coalition between the Maoists and Oli and so on. And the exchange of visits, the exchanges between the armies, and the talk of army exercises, massive amounts of aid, checkbook diplomacy, as you pointed out, a very big checkbook with very huge amounts, although really don't see how much of it has really been disbursed, but that is the elephant in the room. That is a factor that India has to contend with. Now, one is our relationship with China. That will be, of course, the main thing that we need to do. The other thing is, what do we do as far as Nepal itself is concerned within the boundaries of the India-Nepal relationship dealing with China? I think we have to make it very clear to Nepal what are the red lines. While we absolutely do not want to be seen as meddling in Nepal's internal affairs, and while Nepal has absolute right as a sovereign country to do whatever it likes to do in terms of its international relations, it's equally true that in terms of our national security interests, Nepal must understand our legitimate concerns. This is a matter for diplomacy. This is a matter for frank talk between the leadership, and this is what we need to keep an eye on. I'll have to leave it at that, because this is basically, again, something that is evolving and something that India needs to be very careful about in terms of our overall relationship with China, and in terms of China's overall look at the world and its determination to dominate first Asia and then be a dominant factor in the world, in which it sees India as a competitor. Above all, we need political will on both sides, patience, a willingness to accept incremental improvements rather than grand gestures. because the bottom line is that unless we do that, neither side gains an inch. It actually is counterproductive. But on the other hand, given that political will, given the refusal to get distracted by certain things that can be pushed aside, I would still remain an optimist. But as I said, it is, in terms of Nepal's internal dynamics, particularly the situation in the Tarai, still an open question as to the stability part of it will, I think, depend upon how truly the so far ruling elite of Kathmandu is willing to accept that the new Nepal must accept everybody in Nepal, and that it cannot cherry pick and proceed with a democratic goal. Thank you.